Well, I'm putting things away here. I have to say that I think it's very unfair to make anyone preach after listening to a gospel choir sing a Stevie Wonder song. I feel like I've been set up. So give me the benefit of the doubt. For those of you who were not here last week, and there are probably some of you who aren't here this week because I'm back, I'm Ned Mulligan. I'm an Episcopal priest. I'm allowed to wear a collar. I'm the director of spiritual life at the St. John's School in Houston, Texas. And my wife Pam and I are almost 20 years worth of very intimate friendship with Robert and Regina, which is why we're here today. And I'd also like to thank the chapel in general and Charla and Caroline for their generosity and for how welcoming everybody's been. We actually went on a raft trip, which my wife Pam describes as something that was not on her bucket list. But by the end of the trip, she said that she thought maybe it was a little boring near the end. That was self-serving, by the way. I want to start this morning by asking a couple of questions that won't embarrass anybody. The first one of which you don't have to really respond to, because the question is there anyone out there who likes to be wrong? You like to be wrong? Stand up. Second question. Raise your hand if you like to be right. We all like to be right, don't we? It's a matter of human nature. Not necessarily in the context of putting someone down, but in the context of wanting to seem to be thoughtful. Someone with sufficient information to form an opinion that has meaning at some level, or that you have a view that is a result of critical thinking, perhaps education, thoughtful analysis. We often find ourselves defending our rightness, don't we? Perhaps as a matter of pride, or maybe arrogance, or the belief that we have insight on issues of importance. Pam and I often have conversations in which we both assert that we're right. I'm sure many of you have that same situation going on in your familial relationships. Most of the time, Pam's and my conversations have to do, particularly now that we're in our early 60s, with our memory. Our memory of a particular event, or what someone said, or the name of someone we just met. That's what this week has been about. And that conversation started the moment we hit the car on the way down the hill from Snowmass. What was so-and-so's name? What was that person's name? And we had a different take on a couple of people, and we're still trying to figure it out. The process of asserting our rightness together goes something like this. We both become adamant that the other was either not paying attention or is probably approaching senility. Both the lack of attention and approaching senility are probably true. Then we each go searching for evidence to support our respective positions. And despite the fact that I spent 25 years as a trial lawyer accumulating meaningful evidence for my clients, I somehow am less successful in collecting favorable evidence for myself. Right, dear? As a true confession, a couple of years ago, we were on a trip to Atlanta. I've always prided myself in being able to make arrangements that work and things flow okay, and I don't get nervous, and I like to fly, and everything works fine, and frankly, we've never lost any luggage. That's all luck, right? I went ahead, I made the plane reservations, the car rental, and hotel arrangements, and the trip went without a hitch until we arrived at the airport to return home. I went up to the kiosk confidently, put in my reservation number, and there was no ticket. I discovered that I'd made the reservation for the following Friday afternoon, and we did not, in fact, have tickets to get home. I had to spend additional time and money on my cell phone begging some nice person at Delta to get us on a plane that day. We actually got on a plane that day for lots of extra money and after a 4-hour wait. Pam was kind about it. and accepted my self-serving and frankly untrue assertion that it wasn't my fault. And that the airline had somehow made a mistake. I owned up to it being all my fault before getting on the plane. I'm sure you all have had the same type of experience at some level in your own relationships. Now, as I did last Sunday, I want to share a little anecdote in my relationship with Robert that goes along with this rightness theme that I'm dealing with this morning. Several years ago, I had a summer parish in Manchester by the Sea, Massachusetts. It was a wonderful gig. We had a house, we were near the beach, we had a nice little parish and nice people in the parish. And Robert and Regina and the kids came to visit us for a long weekend. Saturday night after dinner, and there was some behavior that preceded dinner. If you know Robert, you know what that involved. Robert asked me to take him across the street to the church, which was the second time we'd been in the church. He'd seen it earlier in the day. And he said, I want to go back to the church because there's something I want to do. Oh, boy. He also asserted that whatever he wanted to do was going to be of help to me. I should have been suspicious from the beginning. We walked across the street, and I unlocked the church, and he said, I want to move the altar. Here we go, I thought. The altar in the church was a traditional altar placed up against the east-facing wall, requiring anyone who was celebrating communion to do so with the congregation behind them. Okay? I have to admit that I really didn't like it because it was hard to connect to my congregation. I couldn't see whether anybody was sleeping or whether they were irritated with me or whether they were connecting with God or whatever. I didn't like it. But I also knew that unilaterally moving the altar would result in a congregational maelstrom the next morning. Robert insisted upon moving it out, and there was clearly enough room for me to get behind it for communion. He said, here you go, Ned. Told you this would work. I stood there and thought about how this was ever going to work, and I managed to convince Robert that we should carefully move the altar back to its long-standing east-facing position. After breakfast the next morning, I went into the church to prepare for the first of two services, and I was met by the head of the altar guild, whose name was Marty. Marty was a wonderful person. She also felt she owned the church. She had an absolutely terrified look on her face. Ned, she said, something terrible has happened. Someone has moved the altar. My immediate response, with knowledge of the facts to the contrary, was to say that it looked fine to me. No, it isn't, she replied. For the life of me, I couldn't see how we had replaced the altar in a way that revealed that it had been moved by Robert and me the previous evening. Come over here and look at this, she insisted. She took me to the far left of the altar and pointed to a quarter-inch wide section of carpet on which the altar had apparently rested for years. It showed the pressure line from the weight of the altar where the altar had been before Robert and I had moved it back. I was caught. I said, Marty, don't worry. I moved it last night and put it back so it wouldn't upset anyone. Well, you upset me, she said. I thought someone had broken into the church. I said I was sorry, but she didn't back off. She said the altar had always been that way, and that I, even as the rector, shouldn't be making changes. She didn't ask me why it had been moved or whether I had a solid liturgical or even personal reason for at least seeing if it could be moved. Unlike the altar, she would not be moved. She was right, and there were no other facts that would change her mind or bring her to a place where we might discuss my reasons and possibly change her mind to support me. The desire to be right, to make others know we're right, and then to convert them to our rightness can be unhealthy and destructive, can't it? In the 21st century, in every aspect of our lives, it feels to me like we all think we're right about everything. We're so right about things that we don't have civil conversations anymore. And there's a frightening absence of intellectual discourse with anyone who doesn't agree. The right is right, the left is right, the middle is right, and also most recently powerless. And the solution is to abandon attempts to find common ground and instead to simply attempt to force our rightness on each other. Asserting that we are simply right about things eliminates creativity, doesn't it? And flexibility, and the ability to compromise to solve problems, and yes, to effectively address serious issues that we all know require change. Being right about God and the right way to practice our faith has, sadly, always been an issue in the institutional church, even with loving, committed people who can even detect an almost imperceptible change in the location of church furniture. In today's gospel reading, Jesus first asserts that he's right when he refuses to help the Gentile woman in need and says that the children must be fed first. In an additional assertion of Jesus' rightness, he says that it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. The children to which Jesus refers are a metaphor for the Hebrew people in general, and the dogs are the Gentiles. That's us, folks. Gentiles who at that time were pagans. His description of the Gentiles as dogs was extremely harsh. Frankly, his response was neither compassionate nor loving and sounded more like what we all sound like when we're asserting that we're right. Jesus' mission was, at least up to that point in time, exclusively to the Hebrew people. And his initial uncompromising response made that mission abundantly clear to everyone within earshot. The Gentile woman's extraordinarily humble and faithful response was that she was willing to accept being called a dog, believing that Jesus could help her if he chose to do so. She says to Jesus, "Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Jesus changed his mind, healed the woman's daughter, and the mission changed. Jesus' mission changed to include all faithful people. Jesus changed his mind not just about a trivial matter. He changed his mind about the most important thing in his mission and ministry, those to whom he would minister and who would be included. From that day forward, his ministry included everyone. If Jesus can be persuaded, if Jesus is willing to change his mind, if Jesus' thinking and perspective can change and evolve over time, why can't yours and mine? Many of the arguments we seem to engage in the 21st century related to God continue to be focused on who is right about God. Who is right about God, and what we believe God's response is to important social and cultural issues. Frankly, many of those issues were never specifically addressed anywhere in the Bible because they simply didn't exist at the time. If being right about God leads to a conclusion that is not loving, accepting, and inclusive, then we might spend some time re-examining Jesus' fundamental message. I have an alternative, and I hope thoughtful proposal concerning the issue about being right about God. The most important thing we can do as people of God is to be in a right relationship with God. Let me say that again. What we can do is to strive with Jesus as our example to be right with God and to stop focusing on being right about God. The difference that the change in the preposition from about to with has on the nature of being a Christian is extremely important. Being right about God does not say anything about who we are, how we behave, or how we treat each other. Being right with God says it all. It says that we have faith, and that our faith and beliefs are reflected in the way we use our time, talents, and treasures in our communities and in the world to finally and ultimately make an important difference. It's much easier to claim to be right about God than to be right with God. I'm a very, very hopeful person, and I know personally how difficult it is to be right with God. We have nothing to offer through our faith, however, if it only leads us to believe in our own rightness. Jesus calls us all to be transformed into people who live with God by opening our hearts to allow God to transform us in ways that result in transforming the world. Amen.